Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome to Rare Classic Cars for another Porch Chat for a topic that is sure to be emotional for some. So hang with me here before the emotions get the best of you. We're going to talk about General Motors big block engines, specifically the Chevrolet 454, the Pontiac 455, the Olds 455, the Buick 455, and the Cadillac 472 and 500. And is there a worst one? We'll leave the best discussion for later, but is there a worse one of those engines that I just mentioned? And for those who don't know, unlike Ford and Chrysler, who really use the same engines in the base cars up to the premium vehicles, albeit Lincoln did have the 460 as an exclusive until midway through 1972, GM divisions each had their own big block V8 or small block V8. Sometimes it's technically wrong, or some people say it's technically wrong to call some of the divisions engines a big or small block, like Pontiac, where they're physically the same size, at least the 326 to 455 cubic inch engines. The 265 and 301, which most people forget, do have a shorter deck than the other Pontiac V8s. So I don't know if you call those a small block or not, but they are physically different in size. In any case, is there a worse one of those? I will at least reveal to you my least favorite. And let me start by saying this. I really don't think that there's a worst one, so to speak, because they really are all excellent. They're all excellent engines. They're all very durable. How much better does it get than kind of all cast iron, heavy, reliable, durable? That is really what does quiet, smooth. Those are some of the adjectives that I would use to describe these engines. And there's not one of them that I would say has significant durability issues. They all have a few quirks, but gosh, they're all good. So I don't think that there's so much of a worst big block, if you will. I do have a least favorite, and it's kind of hard to pick a least favorite, admittedly, because they are all good. They really are. But I'm going to do it. And this is going to stir some emotions among some people, but let me know if you agree or disagree. Hey, this is an opinion. This is not a fact. One could debate the merits or demerits of any of these big block engines back and forth for a long time, because like I said, they are all good, and each of them has their own fan. Certainly the Chevrolet is the one that most people recognize, but there were a lot of others. And again, for those who don't know, each of these divisions had their own big block, and as I said, they really don't use any common components aside from some ignition and fuel system components like distributors and carburetors, but mechanically they're totally different. And GM could afford to do that at the time, just given their size and scale. And as I said, it lasted until the 1976 model year, and then in 1977, they really started paring down the offerings from the different divisions and putting some engines from some divisions and other cars like the Olds 403 going in Buicks as well as Pontiacs and Oldsmobiles. The Cadillac 425 stayed in Cadillacs, but there was some sharing. The Buick 350 also going across different divisions. Pontiac 301 went across different divisions. But let's talk about the big blocks and which is my least favorite. So before I reveal that answer, I'm going to repeat. This engine is durable, very reliable. But durability and reliability doesn't necessarily mean that it is the most pleasurable. And durability and reliability only reveal themselves after one has owned the vehicle for a period of time, not the initial impression if you're test driving it on a dealership lot. So this is a very reliable engine, very durable. I acknowledge that. And it's not a worst big block. It's just the least favorite. But here's my least favorite, to be honest. It's the Cadillac. And, why is that? So the Cadillac V8 that I'm speaking of really started life as a 472 cubic inch engine in 1968. Then it increased to 500 cubic inches in 1970 in the Eldorado only. And then this 472-500 continued until 1975 when the 472 was sunset. It just became the 500. Then in 1977, the 425 came out, smaller version of it. And then the 368 cubic inch engine came out in 1980. And in passenger cars, non-limousines, 1981 was the last year for this Cadillac big block, and it actually was the last big block put in a passenger car in 1981. And it ended its life with the V8 6.4. Kind of a tough way to go out for what really was a good engine. But what are some of the good points of it? Very high nickel content block. These things last for a long time if they're maintained correctly, and actually even if they aren't maintained correctly, if you don't change the oil all that frequently, they still seem to last. Unlike other GM engines, particularly the small block Chevrolets, these engines for whatever reason really don't have water pump problems. I've owned 7 of these engines, maybe more. I don't think I've ever had to replace a water pump. I did replace one preventatively because the car's radiator was clogged, and I believe that the radiator being super clogged was why antifreeze was leaking out the water pump weep hole, because the water pump couldn't circulate the appropriate amount of antifreeze to the system and pressure was just building up. But I replaced it anyway. It's the only one I've ever replaced. I've replaced tons of water pumps on small block Chevys, by the way. And it's overall, it's not a glamorous engine. It has cast crankshaft, cast iron connecting rods, 2-bolt mains. It was never designed to be a high RPM runner. The 454 from Chevrolet had forged crank, forged rods. The Pontiac 421, as opposed to the 389, forged crank, forged rods. Even the Buick 455s, like in 1970, had forged rods, not a forged crank. But the Cadillac was just cast iron, and it was never meant to be a rever, so that's okay. But it wasn't super, super strong to begin with. It was very strong for normal applications. But really the main issue why I would say this is my least favorite is it seems the Cadillac always had some sort of an emissions issue with this engine right from the get-go or shortly thereafter, because even the federal cars had air pumps on them. Like my 69 Eldorado has an air pump, my 72 Sedan DeVille had an air pump. Until they got the catalytic converters, really, they always had some sort of air pump. And then even after that, when they went to the 1980 and the 368 cubic inch engine, like in the Seville as an example, or the Eldorado, if you were in California, you actually had to get the Olds 350. You couldn't get the Cadillac engine because the Cadillac couldn't meet emissions. And I think this is really the main issue that I have with the engine, is that yes, it's durable, yes, it's reliable, yes, it is very smooth, particularly the early years. I think the later years where it was a low compression engine, it was still smooth, but maybe not quite as much so, at least from my experiences with it. It still was very smooth by modern standards. But you're talking about a pool of engines that was smooth and reliable and durable. There isn't one of those big blocks that I mentioned that isn't smooth, that isn't quiet, that isn't reliable. They all are. So to differentiate yourself amongst a pool of valedictorians, you can't be a salutatorian among valedictorians. And that's kind of what I think the Cadillac V8 was. And it's really not necessarily due to the engine itself beyond the emissions challenges that I suspect Cadillac had, because these cars are jetted really lean, leaner than the other big blocks from the GM divisions. And what do I mean by that? So take this 1970 Eldorado. I've had those, I've driven them. 400 horsepower, gross horsepower albeit, but 400 horsepower, and 550 pound-feet of torque. Very powerful engine. What's amazing about these engines, though, is if you drive them normally, they don't feel all that peppy. You tip into the throttle, and the car certainly moves, but it doesn't give you that like shove in the back, shoving you into the back of the seat like a Pontiac V8 does, or an Olds V8. The Buicks, no, you didn't necessarily get that either, but they were more of a rever, especially in the 1970, high compression era. They had 256 rear ends in the cars, so very tall rear ends. But the Cadillac really doesn't shove you back in the seat as much if you're just applying the throttle normally. And until you reach a certain point where the secondaries kick in on the quadrajet carburetors, and then all of a sudden the thing flies. It's like a binary throttle. You're kind of tipping in, and then all of a sudden you get a surge of power. And there's not a great in-between linear balance for the power delivery on these engines. If you've never driven one of the other GM big blocks and you drive a Cadillac, you're not going to notice it. But if you have driven another GM big block, like what I mentioned, and you drive the Cadillac, you definitely will. My 69 Eldorado, for instance, beautifully smooth 472 high compression engine, 375 horsepower, 525 pound-feet of torque. If you floor it, the thing moves. I mean, it moves with some alacrity. But if you're driving it around normally, it almost feels like it doesn't have that much torque to it. It feels like it's got a lot of torque, but not as much as the other big blocks, if that makes any sense. And that's kind of how they all are. Now, I solved this by, in the Quadrajets, you can change the primary metering rods and the thickness. And what I do that really works is I tend to decrease the primary metering rod thicknesses by about 4 thousandths. That's it. But that seems to be enough to really help the part throttle tip-ins. You can change the power piston springs so that the power piston kicks in sooner as well. I haven't found a need to do that. Really, the primary metering rods, just changing those makes all of a difference. But of course, that was not what customers experienced when they bought the car new. Nobody was buying a car new to then take home and change the primary metering rods in it. So they all drive that way, where they kind of have this somewhat laggy throttle tip in, especially on the high compression ones. And then all of a sudden when you get into the secondaries, it's like whoosh, a ton of power. And I really haven't experienced that with the other GM big block engines. They all seem to have really great part throttle tip in. The Cadillacs just don't. So yeah, the other thing I would just say is they're rated really high in terms of the horsepower, like that gross engine in the high compression years, 400 horsepower in the 1970 Eldorado. And does it feel powerful? Absolutely. But does it feel any more powerful than the 365, 370-ish horsepower Olds, Buick, Pontiac engines? No. In fact, I would say, having driven all of them and owned all of them, the Chevy and the Pontiac actually feel like the peppiest of the lot, to be honest. So take that for what it's worth. Then how do I, wrap this all up to continue saying it's my least favorite beyond that? Well, the poor engine soldiered on through time and ended life with the V8 6.4, which I don't think anybody would say that system was well developed or ready for prime time, certainly with the primitive 80s era electronics. And yes, somebody's going to say, well, that's the fault of the system, not the engine. It doesn't matter to a customer. If the car leaves me on the side of the road, whether that's a Chrysler 318 with a lean burn setup, or a Ford 460 with an Autolite 4300 carburetor, or a Cadillac V8 6.4, it does not matter to a customer that the engine, especially a customer who bought this car new, that the engine itself is fundamentally sound and reliable, but some component is not. The engine is only as good in a customer's eyes as its weakest component. That's it. So if you mess up an ignition system like the ballast resistor on the Chryslers, you mess up a system like the V8 6.4 in the Cadillacs, that's all the customer cares about. They don't care that the rest of the engine might be good. So, yeah, the poor thing ended its life really on a bad note. And I think that's another reason why I would classify it as my least favorite, because that V8 6.4 setup, really, especially the 6-cylinder mode, I've driven them. The 8 and the 4-cylinder mode, the 4-cylinder mode are okay. The 8-cylinder mode's just fine. The 6-cylinder mode is this imbalanced, weird intermediate phase, and it's pretty awful. So the other thing I would say is these Cadillac engines did come with Bendix fuel injection in 1976, 7, and 8. And it wasn't that great of a fuel injection system either. It had a number of teething problems. And the Seville used a similar one on the Olds 350s. But I've heard about more problems on the Cadillac 500s. And interestingly, these did have a throttle position sensor back then. Believe it or not, you want to know an interesting tidbit? There are only 16 steps on that throttle position sensor. That's it. It can only sense 16 different positions of throttle. But that's not the main problem. They had other issues associated with them. And I think they were okay, but not great. As I said, they did have a number of challenges and a lot of prom updates from the factory. Customers complained about the drivability issues. So that's another reason why it kind of makes my list. And then last, none of the big block engines from anyone were making much in the way of horsepower. in the mid-70s. But the Cadillac 500 in 1976 having 190 horsepower from 8.2 liters or 500 cubic inches. That is the lowest horsepower per cubic inch or per liter of the whole lot of them. Plain and simple. So I think part of that's the emission stories I mentioned. In 76, these cars really have very retarded timing curves. The base timing, I believe, is 6 degrees advanced in 1976. And they really do wake up. If you just rotate the distributor and change that base advance from 6 to 10, it's like a whole new engine. But that's not how the customer experienced it when they bought the car. And they feel pretty gutless, consequently. So smooth but gutless. And even more gutless than the other big blocks that only had a couple hundred horsepower, even slightly less. And the Cadillac was the biggest of all of them. It was 500 cubic inches. The rest were 455 from GM or 454, 460 from Ford or 440 from Chrysler. So having the least horsepower per cubic inch or per liter is also another reason why I put it on my least favorites. So I'm sure that stirred some emotions in you for those who are the diehard Cadillac fans. And let me say, I love Cadillacs and I love this engine and I own them and I have owned them. I've owned 7 or 8 of these cars. And I would own more. It's not a bad engine. It's not a bad engine at all. But in a sea of valedictorians, the best way I can describe it is in a sea of valedictorians, this engine's the salutatorian. And that's not a bad place to be. Second in your class. And it's a pretty large class of engines out there. So it's high atop the list of being good. Just not quite as good as the others. Hope you enjoyed this porch chat. Let me know what you think. Until next time, take care. Thanks for watching this porch chat on the big block engines from General Motors. Hope you enjoyed. Please like and comment if you enjoyed, as that helps the YouTube algorithm serve this up to more viewers like you. And check out the video thumbnails at the bottom left and right for videos YouTube is suggesting. And if you haven't yet subscribed, click the circular icon of the 67 Buick Riviera at the top left to ensure that you're notified of all my future videos. Thanks again for watching, and take care.